Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the sun-scorched highlands of ancient Ethiopia, where emperors once carved their names in stone towers taller than any building in Rome, and merchant ships laden with ivory and frankincense sailed from African ports to every corner of the known world. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through kingdoms that flourished when Europe slept in its dark ages. We climb granite staircases carved into mountainsides, leading to churches hewn from solid rock by hands that believed they were building heaven on earth. We stand before towering obelisks that pierce the sky, monuments to kings whose names were written in scripts older than Latin. We imagine the caravans crossing deserts with salt and gold, the priests chanting in ancient languages that still echo in monasteries perched on cliff tops, the traders negotiating in bustling markets where Africa met Arabia, where Christianity mixed with older faiths, where legends were born. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about memorizing dynasties or cataloguing monuments left behind. It's about the lives lived, the stonemason shaping granite with patient precision, the merchant calculating prices in currencies of cowrie shells and silver, the queen ruling from mountain fortresses, commanding armies and commissioning wonders. It's about the stories whispered through weathered temples and forgotten monuments, the mysteries that survived conquest and time, the voices that refused to be silenced even as empires rose and fell around them. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There is a stone in Ethiopia that weighs 500 tons. It stands 24 meters tall, carved from a single piece of granite, shaped and polished and erected sometime around the 4th century of the Common Era. It is not a natural formation. It is a monument, an obelisk, one of many that once towered over the ancient city of Aksum in what is now northern Ethiopia. And it represents something the world has spent centuries trying to forget. Africa had an empire, not a kingdom, not a tribal confederation, but an empire in the truest sense, one that minted its own currency, maintained a navy, conducted diplomacy with Rome and Persia, controlled trade routes spanning 3 continents, and left behind architectural achievements that still confound engineers today. The Aksumite Empire, flourishing from roughly the 1st century to the 7th century, was acknowledged by the Prophet Mani as one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, standing alongside Rome, Persia, and China. And yet, if you studied history in school, you probably never heard its name. The obelisk is not the tallest structure the Aksumites built. There was another, even more massive, a towering monument that reached over 33 meters before it fell, likely during construction or shortly after. When it stood, it would have been the largest single piece of stone ever erected by human hands in the ancient world, heavier than any Egyptian obelisk, more ambitious than anything attempted in Greece or Rome. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the engineering required to quarry a monolith of that size, to transport it, to lift it, to set it perfectly upright without modern machinery, without steel cables or hydraulic cranes, using only human ingenuity, mathematics, and sheer determination. Imagine the society that could organize such a feat, the wealth required to fund it, the skilled labor force necessary to execute it. Now imagine that civilization being erased from the dominant narrative of human history. The Aksumite stelae are not hidden. They stand in broad daylight, visible to anyone who visits modern Aksum. Local people have always known they were there. For centuries they have been objects of pride, symbols of heritage, markers of a past that never truly disappeared for those who lived in its shadow. But to the wider world, to the academic institutions of Europe and America, to the writers of textbooks, Aksum remained invisible for an astonishingly long time. This is not a story about a lost city discovered in a jungle. This is a story about selective blindness, about how empires can stand in plain sight and still be ignored, about how power structures shape not just the present, but the past, deciding which civilizations matter and which can be conveniently forgotten. The Aksumite Empire was real. Its kings issued proclamations in 3 languages, Greek, Ge'ez, and Sabaean, demonstrating both their cultural sophistication and their awareness of the diverse world they inhabited. They built palaces with sophisticated water management systems and architectural flourishes, showing clear influence from Mediterranean, Arabian, and uniquely African traditions. They traded with India, sending African goods across the Indian Ocean. They conquered territories, and at their height controlled both sides of the Red Sea, making them masters of one of the most strategic waterways in the ancient world. And then they faded, not overnight, but gradually, over centuries, as trade routes shifted, as new powers rose in Arabia and North Africa. By the time European explorers began mapping Africa in earnest, Aksum was a shadow, a collection of ruins inhabited by people whose ancestors had built wonders, but who now lived in relative obscurity. The explorers saw the stones, they marvelled at them, wrote about them. But they could not, or would not, accept what the stones meant. The narrative had already been written. Africans were primitive. Civilization came from elsewhere. Surely these monuments were the work of foreign colonizers, anyone but the indigenous population of the Ethiopian Highlands. This is where our story truly begins, not with the rise of Aksum, but with the moment when the world had to confront the evidence of its existence and decide what to do with that uncomfortable truth. Because understanding Aksum means understanding the politics of memory, the way history is constructed, and the long struggle to reclaim narratives that were never truly lost, only deliberately overlooked. The stone still stands, 500 tons of defiant proof, waiting patiently under the Ethiopian sun. The highlands of Ethiopia are not what most people imagine when they think of Africa. There are no dense jungles here, no lions prowling through tall grass, no images that fit comfortably into the postcards and nature documentaries that have shaped the Western understanding of the continent. Instead, there are mountains, plateaus rising sharply from the surrounding lowlands, peaks that touch 3,000 meters and higher, terrain that is rugged, challenging, and astonishingly beautiful. The air is thin and cool, the soil is red with iron, and during the rainy season the land explodes into green fertility that seems impossible given the harsh, dry months that follow. This is where Aksum was born. The city itself sits in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, near the modern border with Eritrea, positioned at a crossroads that would prove essential to its rise. To the east lay the Red Sea coast, a gateway to Arabia, Egypt, and the trade networks of the Mediterranean. To the west stretched the African interior, source of ivory, gold, rhinoceros horn, and enslaved people, commodities that would fuel Aksumite wealth. To the south were the Ethiopian highlands themselves, rich in agricultural potential, capable of supporting large populations if managed correctly. It was not an easy place to build an empire. The terrain made communication difficult, roads were treacherous, and the elevation meant that diseases common in the lowlands, malaria especially, were less of a threat. But so were some of the agricultural advantages of river valleys like the Nile. Everything the Aksumites achieved they had to work for, carving terraces into hillsides, managing water sources with care, building trade networks that required crossing deserts and navigating dangerous sea routes. But the location offered something invaluable: control. Whoever controlled the highlands controlled access between the African interior and the Red Sea. Whoever controlled that access controlled trade. And in the ancient world, trade was everything. It was not just about moving goods from one place to another, it was about information, culture, technology, power. A merchant arriving in Aksum from India brought more than spices. He brought news of distant empires, techniques for metalworking, religious ideas, languages. A caravan heading inland from the Aksumite port of Adulis carried not just Roman glassware but Roman influence, connecting the African interior to global networks in ways that shaped societies hundreds of miles from the coast. The people who would build Aksum were already there, long before the empire rose. They were farmers, herders, traders, communities who had inhabited these highlands for generations, speaking languages of the Semitic family that had migrated across the Red Sea in ancient times, but had evolved distinctly in African soil. They built in stone, not the mud brick common in much of Africa and the Middle East, because stone was abundant and because building in stone meant permanence, meant making a mark that would outlast a single generation. By the 1st century of the Common Era, something was changing. Small kingdoms and chiefdoms were consolidating, Powerful families were emerging, trade was intensifying. The Aksumites were not the first to recognize the value of their position. Other groups had tried to control these routes. The Sabaeans from Yemen had established colonies on the African side of the Red Sea, bringing with them writing systems, architectural styles, and religious practices that would influence but not overwhelm local traditions. What made Aksum different was synthesis. They did not simply adopt foreign practices wholesale, nor did they reject them out of cultural pride. Instead, they absorbed, adapted, and created something new. They took the Sabaean script and modified it into Ge'ez, a language that would become the liturgical tongue of Ethiopian Christianity and remains in use today. They studied architecture from across the Red Sea but built structures that were distinctly their own, incorporating local materials, local aesthetics, local engineering solutions. They minted coins in the style of Rome but stamped them with their own kings' faces and their own symbols. This was not a civilization on the periphery, imitating greater powers. This was a civilization at the center of its own world, confident enough to borrow but strong enough to transform what it borrowed into something original. The Aksumites understood something fundamental about power in the ancient world, that influence flowed not just from military strength but from cultural vitality, from being a place where people wanted to come, where ideas mixed, where innovation happened. The city of Aksum itself began to grow. Houses clustered around religious sites, markets formed near the palaces of emerging kings, craftsmen set up workshops, and farmers brought their surplus to trade for goods they could not produce themselves. Population growth meant more labour, more soldiers, more merchants, a positive cycle that, if managed correctly, could propel a society from regional importance to imperial dominance. And the Aksumites managed it correctly. They did not rely solely on military conquest, though they were certainly capable of it. They built economic networks, offering protection to traders, maintaining roads, ensuring that caravans could move safely through their territory. They established diplomatic relationships, sending envoys to Rome, to Persia, to kingdoms in India, presenting themselves not as barbarians seeking favours, but as equals deserving respect. The world was taking notice. By the 2nd century, Aksumite kings were wealthy enough to build elaborate tombs, to commission monuments, to support a class of priests and scribes who could maintain records and conduct religious ceremonies. The religious landscape was diverse. Traditional African beliefs mixed with influences from Judaism, from Arabian polytheism, from the gods of the Mediterranean. This was not yet a Christian empire, not yet the kingdom that would define Ethiopian identity for millennia, but the foundations were being laid. The Highlands were no longer isolated. Ships from Egypt docked at Adulis, unloading wine and olive oil, taking on ivory and frankincense. Caravans from the interior brought gold and enslaved people, returning with salt and tools and luxuries. Ideas travelled these same routes, stories of distant emperors, philosophies about the nature of the divine, technologies for building and making war. Aksum stood at the centre, growing stronger with each passing year, its kings growing bolder, its monuments growing taller, its influence spreading across the Red Sea and deep into the African continent. The world had not yet recognised what was happening, had not yet understood that a new power was rising in a place they barely knew existed. But it would. Soon enough, it would. The first Europeans to write seriously about the ruins of Aksum were not archaeologists. They were travellers, missionaries, adventurers, men drawn to Ethiopia for reasons that had little to do with ancient history. Some came seeking the legendary kingdom of Prester John, a mythical Christian ruler supposedly holding out against Muslim powers in the East, a fantasy that persisted in European imagination for centuries despite having no basis in reality. Others came as diplomats, as traders, as missionaries hoping to convert or to understand the unique form of Christianity that had survived in these highlands since antiquity. What they found confused them. Here, in a land they had been taught to think of as primitive, as backwards, stood structures that rivaled anything in Greece or Rome. Massive stone obelisks, some still standing, others fallen, lay scattered across the landscape. Foundations of palaces hinted at buildings of enormous size and sophistication. Inscriptions in multiple languages covered stone tablets, recording the deeds of kings whose names meant nothing to European scholars. The earliest written accounts date back to the 16th century. Portuguese Jesuit priests arriving as part of Portugal's attempts to forge alliances against Ottoman expansion described the stelae with a mixture of awe and confusion. They measured them, sketched them, tried to understand who could have built such things. Their reports filtered back to Europe slowly, often dismissed as exaggeration, the kind of tall tales travellers told to make themselves seem more important. But the ruins were real, and they demanded explanation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European interest in Africa intensified, more visitors made their way to Aksum. They brought with them the prejudices of their age, a conviction that civilization flowed from Europe and the Mediterranean, that African societies were fundamentally incapable of the kind of organization and technical skill required to create monumental architecture, and so they invented alternative histories. The most common theory held that the Aksumite monuments were built by Arabian immigrants, by Semitic peoples from Yemen who had crossed the Red Sea and established a colony, bringing civilization to the benighted locals. This narrative fit comfortably into existing frameworks. It acknowledged the ruins' sophistication while maintaining European racial hierarchies. After all, if Semitic peoples built Aksum, then it was not really an African achievement, not really something that challenged the belief in African inferiority. Others went further, suggesting Greek or Roman influence, pointing to architectural elements that seemed Mediterranean in style, to the use of dressed stone and column capitals that echoed classical forms. Perhaps Alexander the Great's generals had ventured this far south. Perhaps Roman traders had established outposts. Perhaps the monuments were the work of foreign engineers serving local rulers who could never have conceived such wonders on their own. The local population had their own stories. They had never forgotten Aksum's importance, had never stopped revering the stelae as monuments to their ancestors, had preserved oral histories and religious texts that placed Aksum at the centre of Ethiopian identity. But these voices were rarely heard in European academic circles, rarely taken seriously by scholars who believed that history was something written in universities, not remembered in villages. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that systematic archaeology began to challenge these comfortable myths. Scholars like Theodor Bent, Enno Littmann, and later Ethiopian historians began excavating Aksum with proper methodology, documenting their findings, comparing artifacts, piecing together a timeline that relied on evidence rather than assumption. What emerged was undeniable. The Aksumite Empire was indigenous. The architectural styles, while showing clear influence from across the Red Sea, were developments of local building traditions, incorporating techniques and aesthetics unique to the Ethiopian Highlands. The language of the inscriptions, Ge'ez, was related to Sabaean but had evolved separately, suggesting not a colonial imposition but cultural exchange between equals. The material culture, the pottery, the tools, the religious objects, showed continuity with earlier Ethiopian societies, a clear line of development that predated any significant foreign presence. Most compelling were the inscriptions themselves. Written in Greek, Ge'ez, and Sabaean, they recorded the achievements of Aksumite kings in their own words. King Ezana, who ruled in the 4th century, left multiple monuments describing his military campaigns, his religious conversion, his control of trade routes. These were not second-hand accounts written by outsiders, not legends filtered through oral tradition, but primary sources, the kings of Aksum speaking directly across the centuries. The inscriptions detailed conquests, battles fought and won, territories absorbed, enemies defeated. They listed tribute received, gold and ivory and cattle, the spoils of empire. They invoked gods, first the traditional deities of pre-Christian Aksum, then later, after Ezana's conversion, the Christian god, marking one of the most significant religious transformations in African history. They boasted, certainly as royal inscriptions tend to do, but they also revealed a sophisticated understanding of statecraft, of the importance of controlling trade, of maintaining relationships with distant powers. Coins told their own story. Aksumite coins minted in gold, silver and bronze have been found across the Red Sea region, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Sudan, proof of extensive trade networks. The coins bore portraits of Aksumite kings, inscriptions in Ge'ez and Greek, symbols of power and divinity. The very existence of a monetary system indicated economic complexity, a society that had moved beyond barter, that understood currency as a tool for facilitating commerce and projecting authority. Archaeological excavations revealed palaces, multi-story structures with dozens of rooms, sophisticated drainage systems, decorative elements that showed both wealth and aesthetic sophistication. They uncovered workshops where craftsmen had produced luxury goods, evidence of specialized labor, of an economy diverse enough to support artisans who did not grow their own food. They found imported goods, Roman glassware, Indian pottery, Persian metalwork, tangible proof that Aksum was connected to the wider world, that merchants from 3 continents had come here to trade. And slowly, grudgingly, the academic consensus began to shift. By the mid-20th century, it was no longer possible to deny that Aksum had been a major power, that it had been built by Africans, that it represented not an anomaly but evidence of sophistication that had always existed in African societies, waiting to be acknowledged by those willing to see it. The stones had always been there, waiting, patient as only stone can be. Academic resistance to the truth about Aksum reveals something uncomfortable about the structure of knowledge itself. It was not that the evidence was lacking. Inscriptions and coins and monumental architecture do not lie. They exist as physical facts, measurable and undeniable. The problem was that accepting the evidence required accepting a narrative that contradicted deeply held beliefs about Africa, about civilization, about the natural order of human achievement. And for many European scholars, trained in institutions that had spent centuries constructing theories of racial hierarchy, that acceptance was simply too much to ask. The initial wonder expressed by early travellers who genuinely marvelled at the stelae quickly gave way to skepticism when those same travellers returned home and tried to convince their peers. How could Africans, these scholars asked, have developed such sophisticated engineering? How could they have organised the labour necessary for these monuments? How could they have participated in international trade networks spanning thousands of miles? The questions were not asked in good faith, not posed as genuine inquiries seeking answers, but as rhetorical devices meant to cast doubt, to suggest that there must be some explanation other than the obvious one, and so alternative theories proliferated. The most persistent held that the Aksumites were not really African, not in the sense that mattered to racial theorists of the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were Semitic, the argument went, closer to Arabs or Jews than to the Bantu peoples of sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore their achievements could be understood as extensions of Middle Eastern civilization rather than indigenous African development. This theory had a superficial plausibility. The Ge'ez language does belong to the Semitic family, related to Hebrew and Arabic, and there clearly had been migration across the Red Sea in ancient times. But the theory ignored context, ignored the fact that Semitic languages had been spoken in the Horn of Africa for thousands of years, that the distinction between Africa and the Middle East was itself a European construct imposed on a region where people had moved freely across the Red Sea for millennia, that the Aksumites had developed their own distinct culture that was neither purely Arabian nor purely anything else but uniquely Ethiopian. Other scholars pointed to Greek and Roman influence, suggesting that Aksumite civilization was essentially a provincial outpost of Mediterranean culture. They noted the Greek inscriptions, the coins that resembled Roman currency, the architectural elements that seemed classical in origin. But this too was a misreading conflating influence with dependence, assuming that any society that adopted elements from Greece or Rome must therefore be subordinate to those civilizations. The Aksumites had not passively received Mediterranean culture, they had engaged with it selectively, adopting what served their purposes and ignoring or transforming what did not. The resistance was not just academic, it was political and ideological. Acknowledging Aksum meant acknowledging that African societies had built empires, had participated in global trade, had created art and architecture and systems of governance that rivaled anything in Europe. And if that were true, then the entire justification for colonialism, the civilizing mission that supposedly brought progress to backward peoples, became harder to sustain. If Africans had been civilized all along, had built their own complex societies without European help, then what right did Europeans have to conquer and rule them? So the skepticism persisted, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. When systematic excavations began in the early 20th century, when archaeologists uncovered palace foundations and royal tombs and evidence of sophisticated metalworking, the findings were often downplayed in popular accounts. Textbooks continued to ignore Aksum, or mentioned it only in passing. A footnote to the story of Egyptian civilization which itself was often portrayed as somehow separate from the rest of Africa. Ethiopian scholars faced particular frustration. They had access to sources that European academics often ignored: oral histories passed down through generations, religious texts preserved in monasteries, local knowledge about the meaning and significance of archaeological sites. But when they tried to contribute to international scholarly conversations, they were frequently dismissed, their work characterized as insufficiently rigorous or too influenced by nationalist pride. There was a painful irony in this. European scholars, working from frameworks constructed to justify colonialism, claimed objectivity, while Ethiopian scholars, working from intimate knowledge of their own history, were accused of bias. The truth was that all history is interpretation. All scholarship reflects the assumptions and interests of those conducting it. But only some perspectives were granted the authority to define what counted as legitimate knowledge. The situation began to change after the Second World War, when decolonization movements forced a reckoning with the intellectual foundations of empire. Scholars from Africa, Asia, and Latin America began demanding recognition, challenging the dominance of European and American institutions, insisting that their voices be heard in conversations about their own pasts. In Ethiopia specifically, the revival of interest in Aksumite history became part of a broader project of asserting cultural independence, of reclaiming narratives that colonialism had attempted to erase or distort. By the 1960s and 70s, the academic consensus had largely shifted. Major universities were teaching about Aksum as a significant ancient civilization, archaeological expeditions were receiving funding, museums were displaying Aksumite artifacts with appropriate context. The stelae were no longer mysterious anomalies requiring exotic explanations, but recognized monuments of an African empire that had once been among the most powerful in the world. But the damage had been done. Generations of students had learned African history, if they learned it at all, as a story of primitive tribes and colonial conquest, with ancient Egypt awkwardly positioned as somehow not really African, and everything else dismissed as irrelevant. The absence of Aksum from that narrative was not accidental. It was a choice, a decision made over and over again to exclude evidence that did not fit the desired story. And even now, with Aksum recognized academically, it remains largely unknown to the general public. Ask most people to name ancient African civilizations, and they will say Egypt, perhaps Carthage if they remember their Roman history. Aksum, despite having been acknowledged as one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, despite having left monuments that still stand, despite having influenced the course of African and Middle Eastern history for centuries, remains obscure. The stones remember, even if we have chosen to forget. There is a story, told in Ethiopia for over 1,000 years, about a queen. Her name was Makeda, though she's better known by her title, the Queen of Sheba. According to legend, she ruled a wealthy kingdom somewhere in the south, either in Ethiopia or Yemen, depending on which version you believe, and upon hearing of the wisdom of King Solomon in Jerusalem, she travelled to meet him. The journey was long, the gifts she brought were lavish, gold and spices and precious stones, and when she arrived, Solomon was so impressed by her intelligence and beauty that the two became lovers. From this union, the legend says, came a son named Menelik. Menelik would later travel to Jerusalem to meet his father, and Solomon, recognizing his son, offered to make him heir to the throne of Israel. But Menelik refused, choosing instead to return to Ethiopia, taking with him, according to the most sacred version of the story, the Ark of the Covenant itself, the chest containing the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the holiest relic of Judaism. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church teaches that the Ark remains in Ethiopia to this day, hidden in a chapel in Aksum, guarded by a single monk who is the only person permitted to see it, and who will guard it until his death when another monk will take his place. No one else may approach, no scholar may verify. The Ark exists in that peculiar space between faith and history, believed absolutely by millions, impossible to prove or disprove. This is the legend. The reality, as archaeology and historical scholarship have revealed it, is more complex and in some ways more interesting. The Queen of Sheba appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the first book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles, where she is described as visiting Solomon, testing him with hard questions, and being overwhelmed by his wisdom and wealth. The texts do not name her kingdom specifically, referring to it only as Sheba, which most scholars identify with the Sabaean kingdom in what is now Yemen. There is no mention of a romance, no mention of a son, no mention of the ark being taken to Africa. Those elements were added later, woven into Ethiopian tradition probably sometime around the 6th century, when the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, was composed. This text, considered sacred by Ethiopian Christians, elaborates the story, transforming a brief biblical encounter into an epic narrative of love, prophecy, and divine destiny. It positions Ethiopia as the new Israel, the chosen nation where God's covenant would be preserved after the Jewish people failed to recognize Christ. The legend served multiple purposes. It connected Ethiopia to the biblical narrative, granting the kingdom a legitimacy that resonated in a Christian world where descent from David and Solomon carried immense weight. It explained the presence of Jewish practices in Ethiopian Christianity, the keeping of the Sabbath on Saturday, the dietary restrictions, the emphasis on Old Testament law. It positioned the Aksumite kings as the rightful heirs of Solomon, giving them a divine mandate to rule. But here is where legend and reality intersect in unexpected ways. While the specific story of Makeda and Solomon is almost certainly fictional, the broader claim that Aksum had connections to the Sabaean kingdom is historically accurate. Archaeological evidence confirms extensive contact between the two sides of the Red Sea, shared architectural styles, related languages, evidence of migration and trade. The Sabaeans did establish colonies on the African coast, and those colonies influenced the development of Aksumite culture. And Aksum did become a Christian kingdom, one of the first in the world, converting in the 4th century under King Ezana. This conversion was real, documented not just in legend but in inscriptions, in coins that shift from pagan symbols to Christian crosses, in historical accounts from Byzantine sources that describe Aksum as an ally in the Christian world's struggle against Persian Zoroastrianism and Arabian polytheism. Ethiopian Christianity is not a colonial import from a later age, it is ancient, predating the Christian kingdoms of Europe, preserving traditions and texts that were lost elsewhere. So the legend contains truth, just not literal truth. Ethiopia's connection to Judaism is real, though it likely came through cultural exchange rather than through Solomon's son. The Ark of the Covenant is almost certainly not in Aksum. No serious historian believes the biblical Ark survived the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, but the fact that Ethiopians believe it is there tells us something important about how they understand their own history, their own sacred identity. This is the contradiction at the heart of Aksumite history. On one hand, we have legends, stories passed down through generations, woven into religious identity, believed with a faith that does not require archaeological proof. On the other hand, we have the physical evidence, the inscriptions and coins and ruins that tell a different story, one grounded in politics and trade and military conquest rather than divine providence. Both are true in their own ways. The legends are true in the sense that they reveal what the Aksumites and their descendants believed about themselves, how they constructed meaning, how they understood their place in the world. The archaeology is true in the sense that it reveals what actually happened, the material conditions under which the empire rose and fell, the economic and political forces that shaped its destiny. A historian must navigate both. To dismiss the legends as mere fiction is to miss the point. They are part of the story, part of what made Aksum what it was. The belief in Solomonic descent gave Aksumite kings legitimacy, allowed them to claim authority not just through military power but through divine right. The identification with biblical Israel shaped Ethiopian Christianity, making it distinct from the Christianity of Rome or Constantinople, giving it a character that persists to this day. But to accept the legends uncritically is to abandon history for hagiography. Aksum was not a kingdom chosen by God. It was a political entity that emerged in a specific time and place for specific reasons, that succeeded through trade and warfare and diplomacy, that converted to Christianity for reasons that were as much political as spiritual. Understanding Aksum requires holding both truths simultaneously, recognizing that people live in stories as much as they live in physical reality, that myths shape civilizations even when they are not literally true. The Queen of Sheba may never have existed, but her story mattered. The Ark may not be an Aksum, but the belief that it is has shaped Ethiopian identity for over a millennium. This is the contradiction, and it is not a weakness in the historical record but a richness, a reminder that human beings are meaning-making creatures, that we do not just live in the world, we tell stories about it, and those stories become part of the world in turn. The legend and the reality, both are part of what Aksum was, both deserve to be remembered. the question of Aksumite origins became a battleground. Not a literal one, though the Ethiopian Highlands have seen their share of warfare, but an intellectual one, fought in academic journals and conference halls and university departments across the world. At stake was not just the history of one empire, but the larger question of African agency, of whether African societies could be understood as creators of their own civilizations, or only as recipients of influence from elsewhere. The debate centered on a deceptively simple question: where did the Aksumites come from? One school of thought, dominant in early European scholarship, held that Aksumite civilization was essentially a transplant, that migrants from southern Arabia, specifically from the Sabaean kingdom in what is now Yemen, had crossed the Red Sea sometime around the first millennium before the Common Era and established themselves in the Ethiopian highlands. These migrants, the theory went, brought with them the technologies, the writing system, the architectural knowledge, and the state organization that would eventually develop into the Aksumite Empire. The evidence for this theory seemed compelling at first glance. The Ge'ez language is indeed Semitic, related to the languages spoken in southern Arabia. The Aksumite writing system is derived from the Sabaean script, modified but clearly related. Architectural elements in Aksum, particularly the use of dressed stone and certain decorative motifs, show clear parallels with Sabaean buildings in Yemen. Archaeological excavations have revealed Sabaean inscriptions in Ethiopia, proof of a direct presence. But the theory had problems, significant ones that became harder to ignore as more evidence accumulated. First, it assumed a one-way flow of influence, from Arabia to Africa, without considering that exchange might have been mutual, that Africans might have influenced Arabian culture as much as Arabians influenced African culture. The Red Sea is not that wide. People had been crossing it for thousands of years before the rise of either Saba or Aksum, and ideas travel in both directions. Second, it underestimated indigenous development. Archaeological work in Ethiopia has revealed that complex societies existed in the region long before any significant Sabaean presence, that stone-building traditions predated Arabian influence, that agriculture and animal husbandry had been practiced for millennia. The Aksumites did not emerge from nothing when Sabaeans arrived. They emerged from centuries of local development, building on foundations laid by their ancestors. Third, the genetic evidence does not support a massive population replacement. Modern Ethiopians, including those from the Tigray region where Aksum was located, show continuity with ancient populations, suggesting that while there was certainly some migration and intermarriage, the Aksumites were primarily descended from people who had lived in the highlands for thousands of years, not from Arabian colonists who replaced or overwhelmed the indigenous population. An alternative theory, championed by Ethiopian scholars and increasingly accepted internationally, presents a more nuanced picture. This theory acknowledges Sabaean influence but frames it as one element among many in a complex process of cultural synthesis. Yes, there were Sabaean colonies on the African side of the Red Sea. Yes, there was trade and migration. Yes, the Aksumites borrowed elements of Sabaean culture. But the civilization that emerged was not Sabaean. It was Ethiopian, a unique creation that drew on multiple sources, local and foreign, African and Arabian, indigenous and imported, and forged them into something new. The debate extended beyond origins to questions of influence and power. Some scholars argued that Aksum was essentially a client state of Rome, that its wealth and power derived from serving as an intermediary in Roman trade with India and the Far East, and that when Rome declined, Aksum declined as well. This theory positioned Aksum as dependent, as lacking the internal dynamism to sustain itself without external patronage. Others countered that Aksum was an independent power, that it traded with Rome as an equal, not as a subordinate, and that its decline had more to do with changes in trade routes and the rise of new powers in Arabia than with any dependency on Rome. The evidence for this view is strong. Aksumite kings minted their own currency, conducted their own foreign policy, and engaged in military campaigns that had nothing to do with Roman interests. The question of religion sparked its own debates. When did Christianity arrive in Aksum? How did it spread? Was the conversion of King Ezana in the 4th century a sudden transformation, or the culmination of a longer process? And what about the Jewish influences in Ethiopian Christianity? Were they evidence of a pre-Christian Jewish community in Ethiopia, or were they adopted later as part of the Solomonic legend? The traditional account, preserved in Ethiopian sources, holds that Christianity came to Aksum through 2 Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Aedesius, who were shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast, taken to the Aksumite court, and eventually rose to positions of influence. Frumentius supposedly converted King Ezana and was later consecrated as the first bishop of Axum by Athanasius, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Modern scholarship has complicated this neat narrative. There is evidence of Christian communities in the Red Sea region before Ezana's conversion, suggesting that Christianity may have arrived through multiple routes, through merchants and travellers and missionaries, not just through two shipwrecked Syrians. The conversion of the king was certainly important. It made Christianity the state religion, but it may have been recognising and formalising a change that was already underway, rather than introducing something entirely new. And then there is the question of what kind of Christianity the Aksumites adopted. Ethiopian Christianity developed in relative isolation from the theological debates that consumed the Roman and Byzantine worlds, the arguments about the nature of Christ, about the Trinity, about authority and doctrine. As a result, it preserved practices and beliefs that were condemned as heretical elsewhere. It kept elements of Jewish law. It developed its own monastic traditions. It venerated saints that other churches did not recognize. Was this evidence of an earlier, purer form of Christianity, closer to the Jewish roots of the faith? Or was it simply the result of geographical isolation, of being far enough from the centers of Christian power that Ethiopian Christians could develop their own traditions without interference? Historians continue to debate these questions. Some see Ethiopian Christianity as a fascinating example of religious evolution in isolation. Others see it as evidence of deeper connections to ancient Jewish communities. Still others focus on the political functions of religion, the way Ezana's conversion strengthened Aksum's ties to the Byzantine Empire and positioned the kingdom as a player in the geopolitical struggles of late antiquity. What is clear is that none of these debates can be settled with simple answers. Aksum was not purely African or purely Arabian, not purely independent or purely dependent, not purely Christian or purely influenced by Judaism. It was all of these things at once, a civilization that existed at multiple crossroads, geographical and cultural and religious, absorbing influences from everywhere and creating something that belonged entirely to itself. The theories will continue to evolve as new evidence emerges, as new techniques allow archaeologists to extract more information from old sites, as scholars from diverse backgrounds bring new perspectives to old questions. But the underlying truth remains: Aksum was real, it was powerful, and it was African, whatever else it may also have been. The debate itself is a kind of testament, proof that Aksum matters enough to argue about, that its story is complex enough to sustain multiple interpretations. The stones do not take sides, they simply stand, waiting for us to understand them. Archaeology is detective work conducted in dirt and stone. Every excavation is a crime scene of sorts, though the crime is only time itself, the slow obliteration of evidence, the patient work of decay. Archaeologists arrive centuries or millennia after the fact, armed with trowels and brushes and measuring tapes, trying to reconstruct what happened from fragments and traces, from the things people left behind intentionally and the things they discarded without thought. At Aksum, the investigation began in earnest in the early 20th century. The German Aksum expedition, led by Enno Littmann, arrived in 1906 and spent months systematically surveying the site, measuring the stelae, copying inscriptions, excavating tombs. This was not the casual curiosity of earlier travellers, but professional archaeology, methodical documentation, the application of scientific principles to the study of the past. What they found exceeded expectations. The stelae were only the most visible remnants of a much larger complex. Beneath the surface lay palaces, residences, workshops, storage facilities, the infrastructure of a major city. The expedition mapped these structures, photographed them, collected artifacts, and published their findings in detailed reports that remain valuable sources today. But the German expedition was only the beginning. Over the following decades, archaeological work at Aksum continued, sometimes in fits, and starts as political conditions in Ethiopia changed, sometimes with greater intensity when funding and interest aligned. Each expedition added to the growing body of knowledge. Each excavation revealed new details about how the Aksumites had lived, what they had valued, how their society had been organized. One of the most significant discoveries came from tomb excavations. Aksumite elites were buried in elaborate underground chambers, accessed by stone staircases filled with grave goods that reflected both their wealth and their connections to the wider world. Archaeologists found Roman glassware, Indian beads, Persian metalwork, African ivory, luxury items that had travelled thousands of miles to end up in an Ethiopian tomb. These were not symbolic objects, not representations of foreign goods, but the actual items, proof that Aksumite trade networks were extensive and that the elite of Aksum had access to the finest products available anywhere in the ancient world. The tombs also contained local artifacts, pottery and tools and jewellery made in Aksumite workshops, demonstrating that the empire had its own manufacturing capacity, its own artisans capable of producing goods for both domestic use and export. The inscriptions provided another layer of evidence. King Ezana's monuments, carved in stone and written in 3 languages, recorded his military campaigns in detail. He claimed to have conquered the kingdom of Meroe in what is now Sudan, to have defeated numerous tribes in the interior, to have brought vast territories under Aksumite control. For a long time, these claims were treated skeptically, dismissed as the exaggerations of a boastful ruler. But archaeological evidence from Sudan confirmed the basic accuracy of Ezana's inscriptions. The kingdom of Meroe did decline in the 4th century, right around the time Ezana claimed to have conquered it. There is evidence of conflict, of disruption in trade networks, of political upheaval that could be consistent with an Aksumite invasion. While the exact details remain debated, it is clear that Ezana was not simply inventing victories. His armies did campaign beyond the Ethiopian highlands, and they did achieve significant success. Coin evidence added further confirmation. Aksumite coins have been found not just in Ethiopia but throughout the Red Sea region and beyond. Proof that Aksumite currency was accepted in international trade, that merchants from multiple cultures were willing to use it as a medium of exchange. The coins themselves evolved over time. Early issues featured pagan symbols, crescents and discs representing traditional gods. Later issues, after Ezana's conversion, featured crosses and Christian inscriptions. This numismatic record provides a timeline, a way to track changes in Aksumite religion, politics and trade relationships through the physical objects that circulated in the ancient economy. It also demonstrates state capacity. Minting coins requires control over precious metals, the ability to operate mints, the power to enforce the use of a standardized currency. Not all ancient states could do this. The fact that Aksum could indicates a level of organization and control that marks it as a true empire. Architectural investigation revealed sophisticated engineering. The largest of the fallen stelae, if it had stood, would have required extraordinary precision to quarry, transport, and erect. Modern engineers have studied the stone, calculated its weight at over 500 tons, and tried to determine how it could have been moved with ancient technology. The consensus is that it would have required hundreds of workers, a sophisticated understanding of leverage and balance, probably wooden scaffolding and rope systems, and an enormous investment of time and resources. The fact that the Aksumites attempted such a monument, whether or not it ultimately succeeded, speaks to their ambition, their confidence in their own capabilities, their desire to create something that would awe observers and proclaim their power to the world. Excavations of residential areas provided insight into daily life beyond the elite. Most Aksumites did not live in palaces or get buried with imported luxuries. They lived in modest homes, worked as farmers or craftsmen or labourers, and left behind the ordinary debris of ordinary lives. Archaeologists sifting through these layers found cooking pots and storage jars, animal bones from meals, tools for working metal and wood and leather, the material evidence of an economy that supported specialised production and trade. The picture that emerges from all this evidence is of a complex society. Aksum was not just a collection of impressive monuments. It was a functioning state with a diversified economy, a professional military, a literate administrative class, religious institutions, trade networks, and all the other apparatus of civilization. It was a place where people lived and worked and raised families, where merchants haggled in markets, where priests performed ceremonies, where kings made decisions that affected thousands of lives. The investigation continues. Modern archaeology brings new tools, ground-penetrating radar to detect buried structures without excavation, radiocarbon dating to establish precise chronologies, DNA analysis to trace population movements, chemical analysis of artifacts to determine their origins. Each new technique adds to our understanding, fills in gaps, sometimes challenges earlier conclusions. there is still much to discover. Large portions of ancient Aksum remain unexcavated, buried under the modern city, protected from archaeology by the needs of living communities who have their own claims to the land. Tombs almost certainly remain to be found, inscriptions to be translated, artifacts to be analysed. The investigation is ongoing, patient, methodical, and with each discovery, the Aksumites become less mysterious, less distant, more real. They were more, not mythical figures or exotic others, but people, ambitious and creative and flawed, building an empire in difficult circumstances, succeeding beyond what seemed possible, and leaving behind evidence that speaks across the centuries if we are willing to listen. The detective work continues, the truth assembled piece by piece from stone and soil. The evidence lies in layers, stone and metal and bone stacked in the earth like pages in a book, each layer representing a moment in time, a decision made, an object used and discarded, a life lived and ended. To read this book requires patience, care, the willingness to treat every fragment as potentially meaningful, every shard of pottery as a piece of the larger story. At Aksum, the evidence is overwhelming. Start with the stelae themselves, the most dramatic and undeniable proof of Aksumite achievement. The largest still standing reaches 24 meters into the sky, carved from a single block of granite with a precision that required careful measurement and expert craftsmanship. The surface is decorated to resemble a multi-story building, with false windows and doors, architectural details that suggest the stelae were meant to represent palaces or temples, monuments that proclaimed not just the power of the kings who erected them, but the sophistication of the civilization they ruled. The fallen stelae, lying in pieces near its still-standing cousins, is even more impressive in its ambition. Engineers who have studied it estimate that it would have stood 33 meters tall and weighed over 520 tons, making it the largest single stone monument ever quarried and erected in the ancient world. The fact that it fell, probably during or shortly after construction, does not diminish the achievement. It only emphasizes the audacity of attempting such a thing, the willingness to push the boundaries of what was technically possible. These were not crude pillars, but precisely shaped monuments, their surfaces polished, their proportions calculated, their placement carefully chosen. They were meant to impress, to awe, to make visitors to Aksum understand immediately that they were entering the capital of a great power. The inscriptions provide written evidence to complement the architectural record. King Ezana's monuments, carved in the 4th century, record his military victories in 3 languages, demonstrating both the multilingual nature of his empire and his awareness of multiple audiences. The Greek inscriptions were meant for the Mediterranean world, for Rome and Byzantium, proclaiming Aksum as a power worthy of respect and alliance. The Ge'ez inscriptions were for his own people, affirming his legitimacy, recording his achievements in the language of his subjects. The Sabaean inscriptions connected Aksum to the Arabian world across the Red Sea, maintaining ties to the cultural sphere from which some Aksumite traditions had originated. The content of these inscriptions is revealing. Ezana does not just list his conquests, he explains his motives, claims divine sanction, describes the tribute he extracted and the peoples he subjugated. He presents himself as both a warrior and a bringer of order, someone who conquered not for personal glory but to spread civilization, to protect trade routes, to honor the gods. This is propaganda, certainly, but propaganda reveals what a ruler values, what he thinks will impress his subjects and his peers. Most significantly, Ezana's inscriptions document his religious conversion. Early monuments invoke traditional Aksumite gods, later ones invoke only the Christian god, marking one of the most important transitions in Ethiopian history. The shift is not subtle. Ezana does not hedge or maintain both religions simultaneously, but makes a clean break, dedicating his victories to Christ and the Trinity, framing his military success as divine favor for his embrace of the true faith. Coins provide another form of written evidence, more numerous than inscriptions, more widely distributed, more intimately connected to daily economic life. Aksumite coins have been found throughout the Red Sea region, in Yemen and Sudan, and as far as India, proof that Aksumite currency was trusted and accepted in international trade. The coins themselves are small masterpieces, gold and silver and bronze, stamped with portraits of kings, inscribed with royal titles, decorated with symbols that evolved from pagan to Christian as the empire's religion changed. The very existence of a monetary system indicates sophisticated economic organization. Not all ancient states minted coins. Many relied on barter or on foreign currencies, but Aksum produced its own, controlled its own money supply, and maintained the quality and weight standards necessary to keep its currency acceptable in international markets. This required access to precious metals, the technical skill to mint coins, and the political stability to enforce monetary policy. Archaeological evidence from residential and workshop areas reveals the economic foundations of Aksumite power. Excavations have uncovered evidence of metalworking, potters' workshops, areas dedicated to processing agricultural products, the infrastructure of a diversified economy. The Aksumites were not just importing luxury goods from abroad, they were producing their own, manufacturing items for domestic use and for export, supporting a class of specialized craftsmen who did not work the land but relied on agricultural surplus to feed them. Imported artifacts tell the story of Aksumite trade networks. Roman glassware found in Aksumite tombs came from workshops in Egypt or Syria, travelling by sea to Red Sea ports and then overland to Aksum. Indian beads, made from carnelian or glass, show connections to the Indian Ocean trade network, to merchant ships that sailed with the monsoon winds, carrying goods between Africa and Asia. Persian metalwork demonstrates links to the Sasanian Empire to overland trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to Central Asia. These were not isolated finds, but patterns, repeated across multiple excavations, showing that Aksum was not on the periphery of ancient trade networks, but deeply embedded in them, a hub where goods and ideas from multiple continents came together. The evidence also reveals the limits of Aksumite power. Beyond the core territory around Aksum itself, Aksumite control was often more theoretical than real, dependent on alliances with local rulers, on the ability to maintain trade routes and collect tribute, on military expeditions that had to be repeated periodically as conquered peoples rebelled or drifted back into independence. This was not a centralized empire like Rome, but a looser confederation held together by trade, by prestige, by the occasional demonstration of military force. The decline of Aksum is also visible in the archaeological record. Later levels show declining quality in construction, less monumental building, fewer imported goods, signs of economic contraction. Coin production became sporadic. The gold content of coins decreased. Eventually minting stopped altogether. Inscriptions cease. The last datable monument from Aksum comes from the 7th century, after which the written record goes silent. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. People continued to live in Aksum. The city did not disappear. It simply ceased to be an imperial capital. Power shifted southward, new kingdoms rose in other parts of Ethiopia, and the focus of Ethiopian civilization moved away from the northern highlands. But the monuments remained, the stelae still stood, the inscriptions still proclaimed the glory of ancient kings. And eventually, centuries later, archaeologists arrived to read what the stones had to say. The fragments of this lost world, scattered in museums and buried in Ethiopian soil, pieced together through decades of patient work, tell a story of achievement and ambition, of an empire that rose from nothing to become one of the great powers of its age, of a civilization that engaged with the world on its own terms and left behind proof that will outlast empires yet to come. The evidence is there, solid and undeniable, waiting for those willing to see it. The revelation came quietly, buried in academic texts that most people would never read. Aksum was not a regional power or a minor kingdom that happened to build impressive monuments. It was, in the estimation of contemporaries who actually lived through its rise, one of the 4 great empires of the ancient world. The prophet Mani, founder of Manichaeism, writing in the 3rd century, listed 4 powers that dominated the earth: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. Let that sink in for a moment. An African empire centered in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia was considered the equal of Rome at its height, of the Sasanian Persian Empire that threatened Rome's eastern borders, of Han and post-Han China that controlled the most populous region on earth. This was not the assessment of Ethiopian patriots exaggerating their own importance. It was the view of an outside observer, a religious philosopher from Mesopotamia who had no particular reason to flatter Aksum but who recognized its power and influence as undeniable facts. And yet this empire, acknowledged by its contemporaries as one of the pillars of the ancient world, has been almost entirely erased from popular historical consciousness. How does that happen? How does a great power become forgotten? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about the way history is constructed, about who gets to tell the story and whose perspectives are considered authoritative. When European scholars began writing the comprehensive histories that would shape education for generations, they worked from a particular set of sources, primarily Greek and Roman texts, with some consideration of Persian and later Islamic sources. These were the civilizations that mattered to them, the ones they saw as their own ancestors, the ones whose achievements they wanted to claim as part of a Western heritage. Africa, in this framework, was either ancient Egypt, which could be claimed as Mediterranean rather than truly African, or it was blank space, a continent without history, waiting for Europeans to discover and civilize it. Aksum did not fit this narrative. It was undeniably African, located south of Egypt, populated by people who are black by any meaningful definition, built on indigenous foundations even as it engaged with the wider world. It could not be claimed as a Mediterranean civilization, could not be attributed to foreign colonizers without straining the evidence beyond breaking. And so it was simply left out, mentioned in passing if at all, relegated to footnotes and specialist studies while Rome and Persia dominated the main narrative. But the deeper mystery is not just about a mission, it is about what Aksum's existence implies. If an African empire could rise to be the equal of Rome, if Africans could build monumental architecture, maintain international trade networks, develop writing systems, organize complex states, all without European guidance or intervention, then the entire justification for colonialism collapses. The civilizing mission, the idea that Europeans brought progress to backward peoples, becomes obviously false. Africa had civilizations, had empires, had achievements that rivaled anything in Europe. This was too threatening to acknowledge. So Aksum was forgotten, not through malice necessarily, though malice played its part, but through a kind of structural blindness, an inability or unwillingness to see evidence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about race and civilization and the natural order of the world. The mystery deepens when you consider the extent of Aksumite influence. At its height, Aksum controlled both sides of the Red Sea, one of the most strategic waterways in the ancient world. Anyone wanting to trade between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean had to either pass through Aksumite territory or pay tribute to Aksumite power. This gave Aksum leverage in negotiations with Rome, with Persia, with the kingdoms of southern Arabia, making it a player in the geopolitical games of late antiquity. Aksumite military power extended far beyond the Ethiopian highlands. King Ezana's inscriptions describe campaigns in Sudan, Yemen, and throughout the Horn of Africa, claiming victories over numerous peoples and the extraction of massive tribute. Some of these claims can be verified archaeologically. The decline of Miro coincides with Ezana's claimed conquest. Aksumite artifacts have been found in Yemen suggesting military occupation, or at least strong influence. This was an empire that projected power, that shaped the politics of the Red Sea region, that other kingdoms had to take into account when making their own plans. And it was Christian, one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world, converting before Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, before the Germanic tribes that would eventually dominate Europe had even heard of Christ. Ethiopian Christianity developed in parallel to European Christianity, sometimes in contact, sometimes isolated, preserving traditions that were lost elsewhere, developing its own unique character. This challenges another comfortable narrative, that Christianity is fundamentally a European religion, that its spread to other continents was a result of European missionary work and colonization. In fact, Christianity took root in Africa, in Aksum, independently, and maintained itself for centuries in regions where European Christians had no presence and no influence. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not a daughter church of Rome or Constantinople, but a sister church, equally ancient, equally valid, with its own traditions and its own claim to apostolic succession. The mystery is not that we do not know about Aksum. The evidence has always been there, the monuments still stand, the inscriptions can be read, the historical sources mention it. The mystery is that we chose not to know. That generation after generation of historians and educators decided that Aksum was not important enough to include in the standard narrative, that African achievement could be safely ignored without distorting our understanding of the ancient world. But distortion happened anyway. By leaving out Aksum, we created a false history, one that positioned Europe and the Mediterranean as the only centres of civilization, that treated Africa as a blank slate, that denied the agency and achievement of African peoples. This false history then justified colonialism, provided intellectual cover for exploitation, allowed Europeans to tell themselves that they were bringing civilization to peoples who had never had it. The deeper mystery, then, is not about what happened in ancient Aksum, but about what happened in modern Europe. How did a civilization manage to convince itself that an entire continent had no history worth knowing? How did evidence get ignored, sources get dismissed, monuments get attributed to anyone other than the people who built them? How did the systematic erasure of African achievement become so normalized that even well-meaning historians participated in it without conscious malice? These are questions about power, about who controls knowledge, about the ways that present politics shape our understanding of the past. And they are questions that remain urgent today, because the forgetting of Aksum is not ancient history, it is ongoing, continuing in every textbook that skips from Egypt to colonialism without mentioning the kingdoms in between, in every documentary that presents Africa as a continent without civilization until Europeans arrived. The stones of Aksum stand as silent witnesses, proof of what was built, what was achieved, what we have chosen not to see. The mystery is not in the stones, it is in us, in our inability to accept what they so clearly demonstrate. The year was 330, though the Aksumites would not have counted it that way, using instead their own calendar, their own system for marking the passage of time. King Ezana sat on his throne in Aksum, young by some accounts, possibly in his 20s, but already a seasoned ruler who had inherited an empire and expanded it through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering. He was wealthy beyond the dreams of most ancient kings, controlling trade routes that brought Roman gold, Indian spices, Persian textiles, and African ivory through his capital. He commanded armies that had defeated rival kingdoms, subjugated tribes, and extended Aksumite influence across the Red Sea into Yemen. He was, by any measure, powerful, and he was about to make a decision that would change everything. The story, as preserved in Ethiopian tradition and supported by the historical record, involves two foreigners, Syrian brothers named Fragments and Adesius, who had been shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast years earlier. Taken to the Aksumite court, they had risen to positions of influence, serving as tutors and advisors to the young king. Fragments, in particular, had used his position to quietly promote Christianity, establishing contacts with Christian merchants, encouraging the formation of a small Christian community in Aksum. When Ezana came of age and assumed full power, Fragments urged him to convert. The decision was not simple, not the kind of choice that could be made lightly or reversed easily. Ezana ruled an empire built on traditional religious foundations, gods that had been worshipped in these highlands for centuries, deities associated with the land itself, with kingship, with the agricultural cycles that sustained life. The royal family derived legitimacy from their connection to these gods, performed ceremonies that affirmed their divine right to rule, maintained temples and priesthoods that were deeply embedded in the political structure of the state. To abandon these gods for a foreign religion was risky. It could alienate the nobility, could be seen as a rejection of tradition, could undermine the very foundations of royal authority. And yet Ezana did it, converting to Christianity and declaring it the official religion of the Aksumite Empire, making Aksum one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world. The evidence for this conversion is unambiguous. Ezana's early coins feature pagan symbols, a crescent and disc representing the traditional gods of Aksum. His later coins feature crosses, sometimes accompanied by the Greek letters representing Christ. His early inscriptions invoke multiple deities by name. His later inscriptions invoke only the Christian God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The transition is clear, datable, and complete. But why did he do it? Political calculations certainly played a role. By the 4th century, Christianity was ascendant in the Roman Empire. Constantine had converted. The religion was becoming the dominant force in Mediterranean politics. Aligning Aksum with Christianity meant aligning with Rome, with Byzantium, with the most powerful political entity in the Western world. It meant access to allies, to legitimacy in the eyes of Christian powers, to a religious network that spanned multiple continents. But there may have been genuine faith as well. The sources, admittedly written by Christians and therefore biased, describe Ezana as sincerely convinced of Christian truth, as someone who believed he had found the one true God and wanted to share that revelation with his people. We cannot know his inner thoughts, cannot determine with certainty whether his conversion was purely political or genuinely spiritual, but it is worth considering that he may have believed that the decision may have been motivated by more than just strategic advantage. What is certain is that the conversion transformed Aksum. Christianity became the state religion. Traditional temples were converted to churches or abandoned. A new ecclesiastical hierarchy was established with Frumentius, consecrated as bishop by Athanasius of Alexandria, at its head. The religious reorientation linked Aksum to the Christian world, to the theological debates that were consuming the Eastern Mediterranean, to the networks of pilgrimage and scholarship that connected Christian communities from Britain to India. It also created divisions. Not everyone in Aksum converted immediately. Traditional religious practices persisted in rural areas, among populations less connected to the royal court and its policies. There may have been resistance, conflict, persecution of those who refused to abandon the old gods, though the historical record is too fragmentary to reconstruct the details. What is clear is that over time, Christianity became deeply embedded in Ethiopian identity, much so that it is impossible to understand later Ethiopian history without reference to the church. The conversion also had strategic consequences. It aligned Aksum with the Byzantine Empire against Sasanian Persia, which was Zoroastrian, and later against the expanding Islamic caliphates. It made Aksum a player in the religious conflicts that shaped late antiquity and the early medieval period, giving it a role in events far beyond the Ethiopian Highlands. Byzantine emperors would send embassies to Aksum seeking military alliances, asking Aksumite kings to attack Persian allies in Arabia, treating Aksum as a valuable partner in the great game of imperial politics. But the conversion also contributed eventually to Aksum's decline. When Islam rose in the 7th century, when Arab armies conquered the Middle East and North Africa, when the Red Sea became an Islamic lake, Christian Aksum found itself isolated, cut off from its traditional trade partners, unable to maintain the networks that had sustained its economy. The empire did not collapse immediately. It adapted, shifting its focus inward, moving its capital southward, but it never again achieved the heights of power it had known in the 4th and 5th centuries. All of this flowed from Ezana's decision in 330. One choice, made by one man, in one city, transformed an empire, shaped the religious identity of a region for millennia, and created a form of Christianity that would survive in isolation, preserving traditions lost elsewhere, maintaining a connection to the ancient church that would eventually become a source of pride and identity for millions. History is full of turning points, moments when everything changes, when the future splits into different possible paths depending on a single decision. Ezana's conversion was one of those moments, a hinge on which the fate of nations turned, a choice that reverberated through centuries. The stones record it, the coins proclaim it, the inscriptions testify to it. In 330, King Ezana of Aksum chose Christ, and nothing was ever the same again. The immediate aftermath of Ezana's conversion was not chaos, but neither was it seamless. Christianity did not sweep through Aksum overnight, erasing centuries of religious tradition in a single enthusiastic wave of conversions. Instead, the process was gradual, uneven, shaped by politics and geography and the persistent power of old beliefs. In the capital, where royal authority was strongest, where the king's example carried the most weight, churches were built, priests were appointed, and the new religion took root relatively quickly. But in the countryside, in villages scattered across the Highlands, change came more slowly. Farmers who had worshipped at local shrines for generations did not immediately abandon those practices because a distant king had declared a new god supreme. There was resistance, subtle and sometimes not so subtle. Local elites who derived authority from their roles in traditional religious ceremonies found their positions threatened. Priests of the old gods lost status and income. Some communities simply ignored the new official religion, continuing their ancestral practices in private, maintaining the rituals that marked planting and harvest, birth and death, the rhythms of agricultural life. The Aksumite state had to decide how to respond. There is evidence of temple destruction, of traditional religious sites being abandoned or converted to Christian use, suggesting that at least some degree of coercion was employed. But there is also evidence of accommodation, of Christianity absorbing elements of traditional practice, incorporating local festivals into the Christian calendar, allowing continuity beneath the surface of religious change. This pattern, syncretism some scholars call it, would become characteristic of Ethiopian Christianity, a faith that was deeply Christian but also distinctively Ethiopian, preserving practices and beliefs that connected it to pre-Christian roots. The political consequences of conversion extended beyond Aksum's borders. By aligning with Christianity, Ezana was choosing sides in the great power struggles of late antiquity. The Roman Empire, newly Christian under Constantine and his successors, became a natural ally. The Byzantine emperors who ruled from Constantinople saw Aksum as a useful partner, a Christian kingdom that controlled strategic territory, that could threaten Persian interests in Arabia, that shared their religious worldview even if separated by thousands of miles. Diplomatic exchanges intensified. Byzantine embassies travelled to Aksum, bringing gifts and letters from the emperor, seeking military cooperation against common enemies. Aksumite embassies travelled to Constantinople, presenting their king as a fellow Christian monarch, worthy of respect and alliance. These relationships were not always smooth. Theological disagreements would later create tensions, but for a time, Aksum enjoyed the benefits of being part of the Christian world, of having powerful friends who saw its success as serving their own interests. The conversion also created new enemies. The kingdoms of southern Arabia, still predominantly polytheist or Jewish in the 4th century, viewed Christian Aksum with suspicion. When Aksumite armies crossed the Red Sea, which they did repeatedly in the centuries following Ezana's conversion, religion became a justification for conquest. Aksumite kings presented themselves as defenders of Christianity, protecting Christian communities in Yemen from persecution, spreading the true faith to benighted pagans. The reality was more complex. Military campaigns were about control of trade routes, about tribute and plunder, about extending Aksumite power, but religion provided a convenient narrative, a way to frame naked aggression as holy mission. In Yemen, Aksumite intervention became more sustained. By the early 6th century, Aksum had effectively colonized parts of the Arabian Peninsula, installing client kings, maintaining garrisons, attempting to impose religious and political control. This expansion brought short-term benefits, more territory, more tribute, more prestige, but it also overstretched Aksumite resources and created resentments that would eventually contribute to the empire's decline. The rise of Christianity in Aksum coincided with the empire's greatest territorial extent. Under kings like Caleb, who ruled in the early 6th century, Aksumite power reached its peak. Caleb led military expeditions into Yemen, claiming to be acting in defense of persecuted Christians, defeating the Jewish king Dunuaz and installing an Aksumite client on the Yemeni throne. Byzantine sources praised Caleb as a Christian hero, a defender of the faith, and for a brief moment Aksum seemed poised to become the dominant power in the Red Sea region. But empires that expand often carry the seeds of their own decline. The Arabian campaigns were expensive, requiring large armies to be transported across the Red Sea, supplied over long distances, maintained in hostile territory. The tribute extracted from conquered territories helped offset these costs, but not entirely, and the resentment generated by foreign occupation created instability, rebellions that required additional military expeditions to suppress, a cycle that drained resources without providing lasting control. Meanwhile, changes were occurring elsewhere that would reshape the entire region. In the 7th century, Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, uniting tribes that had long been divided, creating a new religious and political force that would sweep across the Middle East and North Africa with stunning speed. The Islamic caliphates that emerged from this expansion controlled the Red Sea, cutting off Aksum's access to its traditional trade routes, isolating the Christian kingdom from the Mediterranean world. This isolation was gradual, not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow constriction of the networks that had sustained Aksumite wealth and power. Trade routes shifted, merchants found new paths that bypassed Aksumite territory. The flow of luxury goods that had enriched Aksum's elite slowed and then stopped. The empire's economy, heavily dependent on transit trade, began to contract. Royal revenues declined, the ability to maintain armies weakened. Peripheral territories drifted back into independence. The consequences of Ezana's conversion then were mixed. In the short term, Christianity elevated Aksum's status, connected it to powerful allies, provided ideological justification for expansion, but in the long term it contributed to isolation, to the severing of ties with the Islamic world that came to dominate the region, to a gradual withdrawal inward that transformed Aksum from an outward-looking empire to an isolated highland kingdom. This was not inevitable. History is contingent, shaped by countless decisions and accidents, but it is the way events unfolded. The Christian empire that Ezana founded survived. Ethiopian Christianity endured through centuries of isolation, but the imperial power that had once stood alongside Rome and Persia faded, its monuments abandoned, its trade routes lost, its name forgotten by all but those who continued to live in its shadow. The choice made in 330 shaped everything that followed, for better and worse. Christianity became the soul of Ethiopia, the defining feature of its identity, the thread connecting ancient Aksum to the modern nation. But it also set Ethiopia on a path that diverged from the rest of the region, creating both resilience and isolation, preservation and stagnation. The consequences continue to unfold even now, 1500 years later. Ethiopian Christianity is not like other Christianities. Walk into an Ethiopian Orthodox church and you will notice the differences immediately. The building itself might be round, built in a traditional Tukul style that predates Christianity, with a thatched roof and walls painted with vivid images of saints and biblical scenes. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with incense. The liturgy is chanted in Ge'ez, a language that no one speaks anymore but which has been preserved for liturgical use for over 1,000 years. The priests wear elaborate robes and tall crowns, they carry prayer sticks and sistrums, they perform dances during services, swaying and chanting in patterns that seem more African than anything you might find in Rome or Constantinople. The congregation stands for hours. There are no pews, and the faithful prostrate themselves, touch their foreheads to the ground, participate in a physicality of worship that feels ancient, primal, utterly distinct from the restrained liturgies of Western Christianity. This is the legacy of Aksum, a form of Christianity that developed in relative isolation, that preserved practices abandoned elsewhere, that absorbed African traditions and made them sacred. The Ethiopian Church keeps the Sabbath on Saturday as well as Sunday, observing both the Jewish and Christian holy days. It maintains dietary restrictions similar to kosher law, prohibiting pork, requiring ritual slaughter, distinguishing between clean and unclean foods. It practices circumcision, not just spiritually but physically, marking male children on the 8th day as prescribed in the Hebrew Bible. These practices connect Ethiopian Christianity directly to its Jewish roots, preserving elements of early Christianity that were discarded as the religion spread through the Roman Empire and adapted to Gentile audiences. In a sense, Ethiopian Christianity is a living fossil, a window into what the faith might have looked like in its first centuries, before the councils and schisms and theological refinements that shaped Western Christianity. The impact of this distinctive religious tradition extends far beyond a liturgical curiosity. Ethiopian Christianity became the foundation of Ethiopian identity, the thing that made Ethiopia Ethiopia, that distinguished it from its neighbours, that provided continuity through centuries of political upheaval. When other African kingdoms fell to Islamic conquest, Ethiopia remained Christian, isolated but defiant, maintaining its faith even when cut off from the rest of the Christian world. This created a unique historical trajectory. Ethiopia was never colonized in the way most of Africa was colonized, never subjected to the long-term European rule that reshaped the continent's political geography, economy and culture. The Italian occupation from 1935 to 1941 was brief and incomplete, a traumatic interruption but not a fundamental transformation. Ethiopia entered the 20th century with its own monarchy, its own religious institutions, its own languages and traditions largely intact. This is almost unprecedented in African history, and it traces directly back to the Aksumite conversion. Christianity gave Ethiopia a connection to European powers, even when those powers were colonizing the rest of Africa, a shared religious heritage that complicated the simple racial narratives that justified imperialism elsewhere. It provided a basis for diplomatic relations, for appeals to Christian solidarity, for arguments that Ethiopia was civilized in ways that Europeans might recognize and respect. The Ethiopian Church also preserved texts that were lost elsewhere. The Book of Enoch, considered apocryphal by most Christian traditions, was preserved complete only in Ge'ez translation. kept alive by Ethiopian scribes who copied it generation after generation, even as it disappeared from European libraries. When European scholars began to take interest in early Christian literature, they had to come to Ethiopia to find texts they had once possessed and lost. This pattern repeated across multiple books, multiple traditions. Ethiopian Christianity became a repository of ancient practice, a place where elements of early Christianity survived because they were isolated from the theological debates and political pressures that shaped the religion elsewhere. The impact extends to architecture and art. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid stone in the 12th and 13th centuries, are unlike anything else in Christian architecture. 11 churches cut downward into the earth rather than built upward, creating worship spaces that are part of the bedrock itself. They were built centuries after Aksum's decline, but they reflect an aesthetic continuity, a tradition of stone carving that goes back to the Aksumite stelae, transformed into sacred space. Ethiopian iconography developed its own distinct style, showing influence from Byzantine art but evolving into something uniquely Ethiopian, with elongated figures, large almond-shaped eyes, rich colours, and compositions that tell biblical stories through an African lens. These images adorned churches and illuminated manuscripts, creating a visual language for faith that was immediately recognizable as Ethiopian. The church also became the primary institution for education. For centuries, almost all literacy in Ethiopia was religious literacy, taught by priests, focused on reading scripture and liturgical texts. This created a literate class, small but influential, that maintained continuity with the past, that preserved history and tradition even as political power shifted from kingdom to kingdom. The impact on the wider Christian world was more subtle, but still significant. Ethiopian pilgrims travelled to Jerusalem, maintaining a presence in the Holy Land for over 1,000 years, establishing monasteries and churches that still exist today. They participated in the broader Christian community, attending councils when they could, maintaining ties even when geography and politics made communication difficult. In the medieval period, legends of Prester John, a mythical Christian king ruling in the East, were partially inspired by the reality of Christian Ethiopia, by the knowledge that somewhere beyond the Islamic world, there existed a Christian kingdom that had never fallen, that maintained the faith in isolation. These legends shaped European imagination, influenced the age of exploration, contributed to the search for sea routes to India and the circumnavigation of Africa. The preservation of the Solomonic legend, the claim that Ethiopian kings descended from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, gave Ethiopia a unique position in biblical geography, a place in sacred history that legitimized its monarchy and connected its story to the larger narrative of salvation. This legend influenced Ethiopian politics into the 20th century. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, styled himself the Lion of Judah, claimed descent from Solomon, and used that religious legitimacy to maintain authority even as the modern world pressed in on all sides. The impact of Aksumite Christianity, then, is not just historical but living, continuing to shape Ethiopian identity, religious practice, and national consciousness in the present day. Millions of Ethiopians still worship in the tradition that began with Ezana's conversion, still chant liturgies and geyes, still maintain practices that connect them directly to the ancient world. The church has survived empires, invasions, famines, revolutions, maintaining continuity across 16 centuries. This is the impact not just on Ethiopia but on our understanding of what Christianity can be, of how faith adapts and survives, of the diversity possible within a single religious tradition. The stones of Aksum remind us that Christianity is not just European, has never been just European, but belongs to all the places it has taken root, changing and being changed by the cultures it encounters. History tends to remember kings and monuments, inscriptions and coins, the grand narratives of empires rising and falling. But empires are built by people, ordinary people, whose names are not recorded in stone, whose graves are not filled with imported luxuries, whose lives passed in relative obscurity, even as they performed the labour that made imperial grandeur possible. To understand Aksum fully requires imagining these forgotten voices, reconstructing their lives from the fragmentary evidence they left behind. Consider a merchant, someone we might call Abraham, though we do not know his actual name, a trader who made his living moving goods between the Aksumite interior and the Red Sea coast. Abraha would have owned camels or donkeys, pack animals capable of carrying loads across the difficult terrain between Aksum and the port of Adulis, a journey that took days through highlands and lowlands, through territories that were sometimes safe and sometimes threatened by bandits or rival traders. He would have known the routes intimately, where to find water, where to camp, which local chiefs required gifts or bribes to guarantee safe passage. His merchandise might have included ivory, massive tusks from elephants hunted in the interior, valuable throughout the ancient world for carving into luxury items, jewellery boxes, furniture inlays, decorative objects for the wealthy. He might have carried animal skins, leopard or lion pelts sought after in Rome for display in triumphal processions or for exotic fashion. He might have transported enslaved people, captives from Ezana's military campaigns or from raids in the interior, sold in coastal markets to merchants who would ship them across the Red Sea to Arabia or Egypt. At Adulis, Abraha would have encountered a cosmopolitan world. The port city was filled with foreigners, Greek-speaking merchants from Egypt, Persian traders, Indian sailors whose ships had crossed the Indian Ocean with the monsoon winds, Arabian merchants from across the Red Sea. Languages mingled, currencies exchanged hands, goods from 3 continents passed through warehouses before being loaded onto ships or caravans. Abraha would have sold his goods, negotiated prices, developed relationships with regular customers, learned which merchants were trustworthy and which were likely to cheat. He would have purchased items to carry back to Aksum, Roman glassware, Mediterranean wine, olive oil, Indian spices, textiles, the luxury goods that Aksumite elites desired and were willing to pay for. The profit from these trades sustained his household, allowed him to marry, to raise children, to participate in the economy that supported royal power and monumental building projects through taxes and tribute. Now consider Almaka, a stonemason, again a fictional name for a real type of person, someone who possessed the skills necessary to carve and shape the granite that Aksum is built from. Almaka would have learned his trade from his father, or from a master craftsman, spending years as an apprentice before gaining the expertise to work on royal projects. He would have understood stone in an intimate way, known how to read the grain, how to identify flaws that might cause a block to crack, how to use copper tools and abrasive sand to cut and shape granite with precision. When the king commissioned a new stele, Almaka was part of the team that made it real. He worked in the quarries outside Aksum, cutting the massive block free from the bedrock, a process that required careful planning, the drilling of holes in precise patterns, the insertion of wooden wedges that were soaked with water, expanding and splitting the stone along predetermined lines. He helped shape the monument, carving the false windows and doors, smoothing the surface, creating the architectural details that made the stele resemble a palace. The work was dangerous, stone could shift unexpectedly, tools could slip, accidents could maim or kill, but it was also prestigious. Royal projects paid well, and a skilled stonemason could support his family comfortably, could gain recognition within his community, could see his work standing for centuries as testament to his skill. Almaka would have been there when the great stele fell, would have watched in horror as hundreds of tons of carved granite toppled, shattering into pieces, killing workers who could not get out of the way fast enough. The failure was not his fault. Engineering calculations had been pushed beyond what was safe. Ambition had exceeded technical capability, but he would have felt it anyway. The death of the project he had spent months or years working on. Consider also Abraha, a different name this time for a real historical figure, a woman whose existence is attested in limited sources, possibly a queen or a queen mother, someone who wielded power in the Aksumite court during the 6th century. Women's voices are even more difficult to recover from the historical record than those of common men. Elite women left traces, mentions in inscriptions, references in foreign accounts, but their stories were filtered through male scribes, male perspectives, male assumptions about what mattered. Abraha would have navigated a world where power was formally held by men, but where informal influence could be substantial. As Queen Mother, she would have advised her son, influenced appointments, participated in religious ceremonies, managed extensive household economies. She might have patronized churches, commissioned religious texts, supported monasteries, using her wealth and status to shape the religious landscape. Her life would have been constrained by gender but not powerless. Elite women in many ancient societies found ways to exercise authority, to protect their interests, to shape events even when official positions were denied them. And finally, consider the vast majority, the farmers, the people whose labour fed everyone else, whose surplus production made everything else possible. A farmer in the Aksumite Highlands, call him Ezana, though not the king, would have worked land that his family had cultivated for generations, terraced fields carved into hillsides, irrigated by carefully managed water systems. He would have grown teff, the grain that was and remains the staple of Ethiopian diet, ground into flour for making injera, the spongy flatbread that serves as both food and plate. He would have paid taxes, a portion of his harvest claimed by royal officials, soldiers who arrived at harvest time to collect the king's due. He would have been subject to labour obligations, required to work on royal building projects, or to serve in military campaigns, his time not entirely his own but claimed by the state whenever needed. His life was hard, shaped by the rhythms of agriculture, the uncertainty of rainfall, the threat of crop failure and famine. But it was also his life, filled with family and community, with religious festivals and market days, with the small joys and sorrows that make up human existence regardless of historical importance. These are the forgotten voices, the people who built Aksum, who made it function, who lived and died largely unrecorded. Their names are lost, their individual stories unknowable, but their collective presence is undeniable. Without them, there would have been no empire, no monuments, no trade networks, no religious transformation, nothing for historians to study or archaeologists to excavate. They are the human element, the foundation that held everything else up. Not everyone welcomed Aksumite power. The empire was built on conquest, on the subjugation of neighbouring peoples, on the extraction of tribute and the imposition of Aksumite authority over territories that had their own histories, their own rulers, their own reasons to resist. The inscriptions celebrate victories, describe defeated enemies, list captured plunder, but they tell only one side of the story, the perspective of the conquerors. The conquered had their own perspective, though it is much harder to recover. King Ezana's inscriptions describe campaigns against numerous groups, the Beja people to the north and west, various tribes in what is now Sudan, kingdoms in southern Arabia. These were not bloodless administrative integrations, but violent military expeditions, armies marching into territories, fighting battles, burning villages, taking captives. The Beja, a nomadic people who inhabited the region between the Nile and the Red Sea, were frequent targets of Aksumite military action. They controlled caravan routes. Their cooperation was necessary for trade to flow smoothly, but they also raided Aksumite territory, refused to pay tribute, and generally resisted incorporation into the empire. Ezana's inscriptions describe multiple campaigns against them, suggesting that Aksumite control was never complete, that the Beja fought back, that they had to be subdued repeatedly. This pattern, conquest followed by rebellion followed by reconquest, characterized much of Aksumite expansion. The empire's control was strongest near Aksum itself and weakest at the periphery, where local rulers maintained de facto independence and paid tribute only when Aksumite armies were nearby to enforce it. In southern Arabia, resistance was more organized and sustained. When Aksumite kings crossed the Red Sea to intervene in Yemeni politics, they were entering a complex situation where multiple kingdoms competed for power, where religious and ethnic divisions ran deep, where local rulers had their own armies and their own ambitions. Aksumite military expeditions could achieve temporary victories, could install client rulers, could extract tribute, but maintaining control required constant attention and military presence. The most famous instance of resistance came in the early 6th century, during the reign of King Caleb. A Jewish king named Dunuaz had come to power in Yemen and was reportedly persecuting Christians, burning churches and killing Christian merchants. Byzantine sources appealed to Caleb to intervene, framing it as defense of the faith, and Caleb led an army across the Red Sea, defeated Dunuaz, and installed an Aksumite client named Sumyafa Ashwa on the Yemeni throne. But Sumyafa Ashwa did not remain loyal. Within a few years he had declared independence, stopped paying tribute to Aksum, and begun ruling Yemen as his own kingdom, rather than as an Aksumite colony. Caleb sent another army, led this time by a general named Abraha. But Abraha also turned against Aksumite authority, defeating the army sent to replace him and establishing himself as an independent ruler. This was a stunning reversal. an Aksumite general becoming the very resistance that Aksum had sought to suppress. Abraha ruled Yemen for decades, maintaining independence from both Aksum and Byzantium, building churches and dams, leaving inscriptions that celebrated his achievements without reference to any overlord. He even launched a military expedition against Mecca, an event remembered in Islamic tradition and mentioned in the Quran, though he was ultimately defeated. The loss of Yemen was a significant blow to Aksumite prestige and power. It demonstrated the limits of imperial control, the difficulty of maintaining authority over territories separated by sea, the tendency of distant governors to become independent rulers. It also marked the beginning of Aksum's gradual withdrawal from Arabia, a process that would accelerate with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Within the empire itself, resistance took different forms. The conversion to Christianity created religious opposition, people who refused to abandon traditional gods, who saw the new religion as foreign imposition, who resisted through private worship, through maintaining old practices, through passive non-compliance. The sources written by Christian victors do not give voice to this resistance, but its existence can be inferred from the slow pace of conversion, from archaeological evidence of continued traditional practices, from the way Ethiopian Christianity eventually absorbed elements of pre-Christian religion. Economic resistance was also possible. Merchants who were overtaxed might smuggle goods, avoiding royal customs officials, trading through routes that bypassed Aksumite control. Farmers might hide production, underreporting harvests to reduce tax obligations, storing grain secretly to avoid requisitions. These small acts of resistance, multiplied across thousands of people, could significantly impact royal revenues, weakening the state's ability to fund armies and building projects. Labour resistance took the form of desertion, foot-dragging, subtle sabotage. Workers conscripted for royal building projects might work slowly, feign illness, escape if opportunities arose. Soldiers pressed into military service for distant campaigns might desert, refuse to fight with full commitment, surrender rather than risk death for causes they did not care about. These forms of resistance are almost invisible in the historical record, but they are common in all pre-modern states, where coerced labour was the norm and where ordinary people had limited ability to resist overtly, but many opportunities to resist covertly. The most dramatic form of resistance was armed rebellion. When Aksumite power weakened, when royal armies were occupied elsewhere, when succession disputes created instability, subject peoples rebelled, withholding tribute, expelling Aksumite officials, reasserting independence. The sources mention such rebellions only when they were successfully suppressed, but the fact that they had to be suppressed indicates that they occurred. The Aksumite control was never total or permanent. By the 7th and 8th centuries, as Islamic expansion cut off trade routes and isolated Aksum from the Mediterranean world, resistance became more successful. Peripheral territories drifted away. Local rulers stopped recognizing Aksumite authority. The empire contracted back toward its highland core. This was not dramatic collapse, but gradual erosion, a slow process of disintegration that left the Aksumite heartland intact, but stripped away the empire that had once extended across the Red Sea and deep into Africa. The opposition, then, was not a single force or moment, but a constant reality, the friction that all empires encounter, the resistance of people who do not want to be ruled by foreigners, who do not want to pay tribute to distant kings, who value their own independence and autonomy. Aksum conquered, but it also faced resistance, and eventually that resistance contributed to the empire's transformation from a regional hegemon to an isolated highland kingdom. The voices of the resistors are mostly lost, but their actions shaped history as surely as the conquests they opposed. The 20th century brought a new kind of awareness to Aksum, a rediscovery not of the physical site, which had never truly been, lost but of its significance, its place in world history, its meaning for African and Ethiopian identity. This awakening was part of larger movements: decolonization, Pan-Africanism, the reclamation of African history from the distortions and omissions of colonial scholarship. For generations, European historians had told a story about Africa that erased or minimized indigenous achievement, that positioned African societies as primitive, as waiting for civilization to arrive from outside. Aksum's existence challenged that narrative fundamentally. Ethiopian scholars led the reassessment. They had never forgotten Aksum. Ethiopian tradition had always maintained that the ancient kingdom was glorious, that it represented a high point of Ethiopian civilization, that its monuments testified to indigenous achievement. But during the colonial period, when European powers controlled most of Africa, when even Ethiopia faced the threat of conquest, Ethiopian claims about Aksum were dismissed as nationalist mythology, as exaggeration born from wounded pride. The Ethiopian resistance to Italian occupation from 1935 to 1941 became a defining moment. Emperor Haile Selassie, ruling a nation that traced its lineage back to Aksumite kings, that claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba, became a symbol of African resistance to colonialism. His appeal to the League of Nations, his dignified refusal to accept Italian sovereignty, his eventual triumph and return to power in 1941, all reinforced the connection between ancient Aksum and modern Ethiopia, between past glory and present dignity. After World War II, as African nations began gaining independence, interest in pre-colonial African history intensified. Scholars from newly independent nations began writing their own histories, challenging European narratives, insisting that Africa had civilizations before colonialism, that Africans had built states and cities and monuments without European guidance. Aksum became a key piece of evidence in this larger argument, proof that African achievement was real, documented, undeniable. Archaeological work expanded and improved. The Ethiopian government, recognizing the value of Aksum both for national pride and for tourism, supported systematic excavation and conservation. International teams arrived with modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, carbon dating, sophisticated analysis of artifacts. Each new discovery added detail to the picture, confirmed the scale and sophistication of the ancient empire, provided evidence that could not be dismissed or attributed to foreign influence. UNESCO designated Aksum a World Heritage Site in 1980, recognizing its universal value, its importance not just to Ethiopia but to all humanity. The designation brought attention, funding, international recognition, but it also brought challenges. How to preserve ancient monuments in a living city, how to balance the needs of archaeologists with the rights of local communities who lived among the ruins, how to develop tourism without destroying the very sites that tourists came to see. These questions remain ongoing, but the designation itself represented a kind of vindication, an acknowledgement that Aksum belonged in the same category as Rome, Athens, and the pyramids of Egypt, that it was a site of world historical importance. The cultural renaissance extended beyond archaeology. Ethiopian artists began drawing on Aksumite motifs, incorporating ancient symbols into modern art, music, and literature. The stelae appeared on currency, on government seals, in public monuments, visible reminders of a glorious past that could inspire pride in the present. Ethiopian nationalism, which had always had a historical dimension, embraced Aksum as a foundational myth, a proof of civilization that predated European contact. This embrace was not without complications. Aksum was located in Tigray, one of Ethiopia's regions, and its legacy became entangled in regional politics, in debates about power and identity, in tensions between different Ethiopian ethnic groups. Was Aksum the heritage of all Ethiopians, or specifically of the Tigray people? Did other Ethiopian groups have equal claim to its legacy, or was it a regional rather than national patrimony? These questions reflect ongoing realities of Ethiopian politics, the challenge of building national unity in a diverse country with multiple ethnic groups, languages, and historical traditions. Aksum became a symbol, powerful and contested, claimed by different groups for different purposes. Internationally, the awakening took longer but has accelerated in recent decades. African history is now taught in major universities. Aksum appears in textbooks. Documentaries feature the empire alongside other ancient civilizations. The narrative of Africa as a continent without history has been thoroughly debunked, replaced by a recognition of African diversity, complexity, and achievement. But popular consciousness still lags. Ask most people in the West to name ancient African civilizations, and they will still say Egypt, if they say anything at all. Aksum remains relatively unknown outside specialist circles, a gap between academic recognition and public awareness that reflects the persistence of old narratives, the slow pace of educational change, the tendency of popular media to repeat familiar stories rather than explore unfamiliar ones. The awakening continues, driven by Ethiopian scholars, by diaspora communities seeking connections to African heritage, by educators working to decolonize curricula, by a growing recognition that world history has been too narrowly defined, too focused on Europe and the Mediterranean, too dismissive of achievements that do not fit comfortable narratives. Aksum stands as evidence, undeniable and permanent, that Africa had empires, that Africans built monuments, that indigenous achievement was real and substantial. The stelae that once proclaimed the power of ancient kings now proclaim a different message, that African history is world history, that civilization is not the property of any one continent or people, that the human capacity for greatness expresses itself in all times and places. The stones remain, as they have for 16 centuries, waiting patiently for the world to finally see them clearly, to understand what they represent, to acknowledge what they prove. The awakening is not complete, but it has begun, and once begun, it cannot be reversed. The deepest truth about Aksum is not about Aksum at all. It is about us, about how we construct knowledge, about whose stories we tell and whose we ignore, about the politics of memory and the power to define what counts as history. Aksum existed. That is not in dispute. The evidence is overwhelming. The monuments stand, the inscriptions can be read, the coins can be weighed and analysed. What is in dispute, what has always been in dispute, is what that existence means, what we are willing to accept about African capability, about the diversity of human achievement, about the narratives we have constructed to justify power in the present. For centuries, the dominant narrative of world history positioned Europe at the centre, as the pinnacle of civilization, as the source from which progress flowed to lesser peoples in other continents. This narrative required that Africa be primitive, that African societies be simple, that African achievements be minimal or attributable to outside influence. Egypt could be acknowledged barely, but only by claiming it as not really African, as Mediterranean, as Caucasian, as anything but black. Everything south of Egypt was blank space, tribes without history, peoples without culture, a continent waiting for Europeans to bring civilization through colonization. Aksum shatters that narrative completely. Here is an African empire built by Africans in the African interior, with no significant European involvement, that reached a level of sophistication equal to Rome, that minted currency, maintained trade networks spanning 3 continents, built monuments that still stand after 16 centuries. It cannot be explained away, cannot be attributed to Greeks or Arabs or anyone else without distorting the evidence beyond recognition. And the fact that Aksum has been systematically ignored, excluded from textbooks, absent from popular consciousness, reveals the lengths to which the dominant narrative had to go to maintain itself. This was not accidental omission, it was deliberate erasure, the construction of ignorance where knowledge existed, the choice to not know what could have been known if anyone had cared to look. The revelation, then, is about the fragility of historical narratives, about how easily evidence can be ignored when it contradicts what we want to believe. It is about the power of institutions to shape knowledge, to decide what gets taught and what gets forgotten, to construct versions of the past that serve present political purposes. Colonial powers needed to believe that Africans were incapable of civilization, that colonialism was a civilizing mission, that European rule was justified by African backwardness. Acknowledging Aksum, acknowledging that Africans had built empires, would undermine that justification, would force uncomfortable questions about who actually benefited from colonialism and what moral right Europeans had to impose their rule on societies that had their own rich histories. So Aksum was forgotten, not because the evidence disappeared, but because it was inconvenient. Even after decolonization, the narrative has been slow to change. Education systems built during colonial rule persisted. Textbooks written from European perspectives continued to be used. The institutional momentum of ignorance proved difficult to overcome. It is easier to repeat familiar stories than to incorporate new information, easier to teach the history we learned than to revise it based on evidence we were never taught. The revelation extends beyond Aksum to the broader question of African history and achievement. If Aksum could be ignored despite overwhelming evidence, what else has been ignored? What other African kingdoms and empires have been excluded from the historical narrative? How much of what we think we know about Africa is actually ignorance, the absence of knowledge masquerading as knowledge itself? The answer is, a great deal. Aksum was not the only sophisticated African state. It was one among many. The kingdom of Kush, which Ezana claimed to have conquered, had its own monuments, its own writing system, its own traditions of kingship. The kingdom of Ghana, not located in modern Ghana but further north, controlled trans-Saharan gold trade and built a sophisticated state. The Empire of Mali, famous for Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca, during which he distributed so much gold that he temporarily disrupted Mediterranean economies, controlled vast territories and supported centres of Islamic learning. The Kingdom of Congo, encountered by Portuguese explorers, had complex political institutions and diplomatic relationships. All of these are African achievements, all were built by Africans, none required European intervention or guidance, and all have been, to varying degrees, excluded from mainstream historical narratives, relegated to specialist studies, kept out of the story of human civilization that most people learn. The revelation is that history is constructed, that it reflects power, that those who control institutions control what is remembered and what is forgotten. For too long, European and American institutions controlled the writing of history, and they wrote a history that served their interests, that justified their power, that positioned them as superior and others as inferior. This was not neutral scholarship. It was not objective truth-seeking. It was ideology disguised as science, politics disguised as education. Recovering Aksum, bringing it into popular consciousness, teaching it alongside Rome and Athens and Han China, is not just about correcting a historical error. It is about challenging the power structures that created that error, about insisting that African voices be heard, about decolonizing knowledge itself. It is about recognizing that human achievement is universal, that every continent has contributed to civilization, that no people have a monopoly on progress or sophistication. It is about humility, about acknowledging that what we were taught was incomplete, biased, sometimes deliberately false, and that we have a responsibility to seek better knowledge, more accurate knowledge, knowledge that includes rather than excludes. The stones of Aksum stand as silent accusers, pointing to the gap between what we could have known and what we were taught, between the evidence that existed and the narratives that were constructed despite that evidence. They challenge us to ask why, to examine our own assumptions, to question who benefits from our ignorance and who suffers from it. The deepest truth is uncomfortable. It requires admitting that much of what passed for education was propaganda, that institutions we trusted were unreliable, that the story we learned about human history was systematically distorted to serve power. But discomfort is the price of truth, and truth, once encountered, demands response. We cannot unknow Aksum now that we know it, cannot unsee the evidence now that it has been revealed. We can only decide what to do with that knowledge, whether to integrate it into a more complete and honest understanding of human history, or to continue the old patterns of selective ignorance, of comfortable falsehood. The revelation is that the choice has always been ours, and it remains ours still. Stand for a moment in the quiet of Aksum, among the stelae that have stood for 16 centuries, and consider what they represent. Not just monuments to ancient kings, though they are that. Not just evidence of a forgotten empire, though they certainly provide that, but symbols of something deeper, something that resonates across time and speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, about civilization, about what we are capable of when we work together toward common purpose. The people who built these monuments were not different from us in any essential way. They were not superhuman, not possessed of abilities we lack, not operating with fundamentally different brains or bodies. They were human beings, with the same basic cognitive capabilities that we possess, the same capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for cooperation, for creativity. The difference between them and us is not biological but cultural, not inherent but learned, not a matter of fundamental capacity but of what they chose to do with the capacity they had. This should humble us. We live in an age that often assumes progress, that treats modern technology as evidence of modern superiority, that sometimes looks at the past with condescension, as if our ancestors were somehow less capable, less intelligent, less worthy of respect than we are. But the monuments of Aksum, like the pyramids of Egypt, like the temples of Cambodia, like the stone cities of the Inca, remind us that human ingenuity is not modern, that our ancestors solved problems we would struggle to solve, that they achieved things we might not be able to replicate even with our advanced tools. How would we move a 500-ton stone today? We could do it, certainly. We have cranes and trucks and sophisticated engineering, but it would not be easy, would not be simple, would require careful planning and significant resources. The Aksumites did it with rope and wood and human muscle, with mathematics and leverage and determination. That deserves respect, deserves recognition as genuine achievement. The reflection extends to questions of cultural diversity and human potential. If Aksum could rise in the Ethiopian Highlands, if Africans could build an empire without European help, then the narrative of European exceptionalism collapses. There is no special European genius, no unique Western capacity for civilization, no racial hierarchy that places some peoples above others. There is only human diversity, different cultures finding different solutions to common problems, different societies developing in different directions based on geography, resources, historical accident, and countless individual choices. This does not mean all cultures are identical in their achievements. Clearly they are not. But it does mean that differences in achievement are not evidence of fundamental differences in capacity. The Aksumites built stelae, Europeans built cathedrals, Chinese built pagodas, each using local materials, local aesthetic traditions, local engineering knowledge. The diversity enriches rather than diminishes, demonstrates the range of human creativity, rather than the superiority of any particular tradition. What does Aksum mean for us, living in the 21st century, far removed from ancient empires and trade routes powered by wind and muscle? It means that history is larger than we were taught, that the story of human civilization includes more chapters than the textbooks covered, that there are entire narratives we were never told that are as important, as fascinating, as instructive as the familiar stories of Greece and Rome. It means that ignorance is not neutral, that what we do not know shapes us as much as what we do know, that gaps in education create gaps in understanding that have real consequences for how we see the world and how we treat other people. It means that Africa has always been part of world history, not a separate story, not a marginal addendum, but central to the human story, contributing to trade networks, to religious evolution, to political experiments, to the exchange of ideas and goods and people that has always characterized human civilization. The reflection asks us to reconsider our assumptions about progress and development. We often think of history as linear, as a steady march from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from ignorance to knowledge. But Aksum challenges that narrative. Here was a sophisticated civilization that declined, that lost capabilities, that moved from complexity to simplicity. Progress is not inevitable. Knowledge can be lost, civilizations can fall, and what seems permanent can prove fragile. This should make us humble about our own moment, about the assumption that modern technology guarantees continued advancement, that our achievements are secure, that decline cannot happen to us. Empires fall, always have, always will, and ours is not exempt from that pattern simply because we have computers and electricity. What can we learn from Aksum about how to build societies that last? The empire endured for 6 centuries, longer than most modern nations have existed, longer than the United States has been independent, longer than most of the countries that currently dominate world politics have existed in their present forms. That longevity was not accidental. It was built on economic foundations, on trade networks that created wealth, on political institutions that provided stability, on religious and cultural traditions that gave people identity and meaning. When those foundations eroded, when trade routes shifted, when external pressures mounted, the empire declined. But even in decline, something persisted. Ethiopian Christianity survived, cultural traditions endured, a connection to the past remained alive. There is resilience in culture, in tradition, in the stories people tell about who they are and where they came from. The reflection finally is about memory and responsibility. We are the inheritors of all human history, not just the history of our own ethnic group or nation, but the full richness of human experience across all times and places. Aksum is part of that inheritance, part of what humanity has achieved, part of the evidence base for understanding what we are capable of. To ignore it, to exclude it from education, to continue telling a story of human civilization that leaves out African achievement, is to impoverish ourselves, to accept a narrower and falser understanding than the evidence allows. The stones stand as an invitation, asking us to expand our view, to include rather than exclude, to seek truth rather than comfortable falsehood, to recognize the full diversity and achievement of the human family. The question is whether we will accept that invitation, Whether we will do the work of revising our understanding, of teaching a fuller history, of acknowledging what our ancestors built in all corners of the world. The stones have been patient, they can wait longer if necessary, but the invitation remains open, waiting, for us to finally truly see what has always been there. The sun sets over Aksum differently than it rises. In the morning, light comes from the east, illuminating the stelae, making them glow golden against the dark sky, sharp and clear and commanding. By evening, the light is softer, warmer, the shadows longer, and the monuments seem less like declarations of power than quiet witnesses to the passage of time, to the centuries that have flowed past while they remained standing. This is how we leave Aksum, in the gentle evening light, the day's heat fading, the stones still warm to the touch. The empire that built these monuments is gone, has been gone for over a millennium. Its kings are dust, its merchants silent, its trade routes abandoned or redirected. The palaces are ruins, the coins are scattered in museums, the inscriptions are read by scholars but no longer by the people for whom they were written. In the ordinary sense, Aksum is dead, finished, a chapter closed in the long book of human history. And yet it endures, not as political power, not as economic force, but as memory, as symbol, as evidence of what was achieved and what is possible. The stelae still stand, the tallest still reaching toward the sky after 16 centuries, still proclaiming in their mute stone language that this place mattered, that the people who built them had ambition and skill and determination, that they succeeded in creating something that would outlast their lives, their empire, their entire civilization. Memory is fragile in some ways, dependent on transmission, on people caring enough to preserve it, on institutions maintaining records, on cultures valuing their past. But memory is also resilient, surviving in unexpected places, in oral traditions and religious texts, in the landscape itself, in stones that remember even when people forget. Ethiopian memory of Aksum never entirely disappeared, even during the centuries when the empire had contracted, when power had shifted southward, when new kingdoms rose and fell, the connection to Aksum remained alive. The Solomonic legend, the claim of descent from ancient kings, the preservation of ge'ez in religious liturgy, the continued importance of the city as a pilgrimage site, all maintained continuity, kept the past present in some form. Western memory had to be rebuilt, had to overcome the forgetting that was never natural but always political, always shaped by assumptions about race and civilization that required African achievement to be denied or minimized. That rebuilding is ongoing, incomplete, contested, but happening, slowly reshaping education, gradually entering popular consciousness. The legacy in stone is the most durable part. Buildings fall, paper burns, oral traditions fade, but stone endures, resisting decay, outlasting empires, providing physical evidence that cannot be entirely erased. The stelae of Aksum are messages across time, communications from people who wanted to be remembered, who succeeded in that desire even though they could not have imagined how or by whom they would be remembered. When you stand before them, as visitors have for centuries, as archaeologists and tourists and pilgrims and scholars and local people going about their daily lives, you are in the presence of human achievement, of people long dead who nevertheless speak through what they left behind. The legacy in memory is more complex. It shifts and changes, gets reinterpreted by each generation, serves different purposes in different times. For Ethiopians, Aksum has been a source of pride, a proof of civilization when the world denied it, a connection to a glorious past that legitimized present identity. For Africans more broadly, it has become evidence in a larger argument about African capability, about the falseness of colonial narratives, about the need to reclaim and retell African history from African perspectives. For the wider world, for those just learning about Aksum, it offers something different, a challenge to assumptions, an expansion of historical consciousness, an invitation to see human civilization as more diverse, more complex, more widely distributed than the familiar narratives suggest. All of these legacies are valid, all are part of what Aksum means, all contribute to its ongoing significance. The closing returns us to where we began, to that sense of wonder at the forgotten, to the question of how an empire acknowledged as one of the four great powers of the ancient world could become so thoroughly erased from popular historical consciousness. We have explored the evidence, traced the rise and fall, examined the politics of memory, confronted the uncomfortable truths about how history is constructed and whose stories get told. We have walked through Aksumite streets in imagination, stood in royal courts, travelled with merchants, carved stone with masons, prayed in churches, resisted conquest, survived decline. And we returned finally to the simple fact of the monuments themselves, to the stones that stand regardless of whether we acknowledge them, regardless of whether we understand their significance, regardless of whether we include them in our narratives of human achievement. They stand as they have stood, patiently, waiting for us to see them clearly, to understand what they represent, to integrate their existence into a fuller and more honest understanding of human history, waiting for education to catch up with evidence, for popular consciousness to expand beyond narrow narratives, for the world to finally acknowledge what scholars have long known. Aksum was real, it was powerful, it was African, and it matters. That is the legacy, simple and profound, inscribed in stone and preserved in memory, waiting for each new generation to discover or rediscover, to learn from or ignore, to include or exclude from the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The sun sets, the light fades, the stones remain, and somewhere, perhaps, in a classroom or a living room or a quiet moment before sleep, someone encounters Aksum for the first time, feels that spark of wonder at the forgotten, begins to ask questions about what else they were never taught, about what other marvels stand unacknowledged, about how much richer and more complex human history is than they ever imagined. That encounter, repeated across countless individuals, is how the legacy continues, how memory expands, how understanding grows, how the work of recovery and acknowledgement proceeds, one person at a time, one story at a time, one realization at a time. The Aksumite Empire fell, but its monuments endure, and through those monuments so does its voice, speaking across 16 centuries to anyone willing to listen, telling a story about human capability, about African achievement, about the diversity of civilization, about the importance of remembering all of human history, not just the parts that fit comfortable narratives. Listen, and you will hear it, quiet as stone, patient as time, undeniable as gravity. The story of Aksum, waiting to be heard,